The room went silent. A U.S. senator tried to humiliate her on live TV, but what this black congresswoman said next, it left the entire room and the internet speechless. Today on Union Show, we dive into one of the most intense political showdowns of the year. Senator Tim Scott thought he had the upper hand when he called out Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in front of the entire nation. But what he didn't expect was a clapback so sharp, so powerful. It didn't just shut him down. It changed the tone of the entire hearing. This wasn't just political drama. This was personal. And it's now going viral for all the right reasons. You're about to witness a real-time takedown that had Twitter exploding, the news scrambling, and millions of Americans saying, "Finally, someone said it!" Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment if you believe truth deserves a mic. This is going to get real, so don't miss a second. The room was tense before anyone even spoke. You could feel it, the tight air, the stares exchanged between political staffers, the way people leaned forward in their seats not just to hear better, but because something about the energy felt off. It was supposed to be another routine oversight hearing, important on paper. Sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. But from the second Senator Tim Scott walked into the room, there was a certain calculation in his movements. His suit was sharp, his stride purposeful, and his gaze focused, not on the issues, but on something else. Or rather someone. Across the polished mahogany table, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat flipping through documents, unaware that she was being sized up. Scott wasn't just coming in to argue policy today. He was coming for a moment. A clip, a soundbite, the kind of viral performance politicians secretly crave but pretend to despise. Cameras lined the back of the chamber. Reporters in tailored blazers leaned on every word. And right in the center of it all sat two black lawmakers from very different worlds, Tim Scott, the Republican senator often criticized for ignoring racial realities to maintain political balance, and Jasmine Crockett, the unapologetic firebrand who wears truth like armor. As the committee discussion meandered, through legal, jargon, and legislative updates, Scott suddenly leaned forward, tapped his mic gently, and turned his attention directly to Crockett. His tone was calm, disarming even, but what followed had the entire room holding its breath. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began slowly, "I find your contributions passionate. But what I'm not hearing is unity. What I'm not hearing is solutions. What I do hear, constantly, is anger, division, rhetoric that makes things worse, not better." He didn't blink. He didn't smirk. He wanted it to sound like a reasonable observation, like a mentor correcting a student, but it was anything but that. It was a calculated blow dressed in civility, one of those comments designed to push the boundaries of respect while maintaining just enough professionalism to deny wrongdoing later. "You speak of injustice," he continued, "but I'd argue that constantly invoking racism and victimhood only creates more distance between communities. If we're serious about healing this country, we need less heat and more light." There it was. The line he was building up to. Less heat, more light. Something for the soundbite. Something that would play well on conservative media later that night. A subtle coded way of saying, "Stop being loud. Stop being difficult. Stop making me uncomfortable." The room was still. Nobody breathed. Even those on Scott's side didn't clap or nod. Not because they disagreed, but because everyone knew what had just happened. This wasn't politics. This was provocation. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She stared straight ahead, lips pressed. But her eyes flickered, calculating, measuring, and not just the words, but the intent behind them. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to paint her passion as aggression. It wouldn't be the last. But in that moment, sitting in a room full of power and pressure, she knew exactly what Scott was doing. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to snap, to look emotional, to fall into the trap of being labeled another angry black woman on national television. But what he didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett didn't play by those rules. And what was coming next would make it very clear. He had just picked a fight he wasn't ready for. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. That's the part that stunned people later when they watched the clip back. There was no flinch, no raised voice, no snapping back with raw emotion, just silence and then composure. It was the kind of stillness that tells you something massive is building beneath the surface, something unshakable. She slowly lifted her eyes toward Tim Scott, met his gaze, and leaned slightly toward the microphone. Her tone was low, calm, razor sharp, not the energy of someone defending themselves, but the energy of someone who just realized she's holding all the cards. "Senator Scott," she began, her voice steady as steel, "I don't need your permission to speak with urgency about injustice. I don't need your approval to be passionate about people who are dying, who are suffering, who are invisible in the eyes of this system." A beat passed. You could hear the faint clicking of a journalist's pen stopping mid-note. "You say I sound angry," she said. "But maybe that's because I'm not up here pretending everything is fine. Maybe I sound angry because I see things that should make every one of us angry, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it just to make you or anybody else feel more comfortable." The camera didn't cut away. It stayed locked on her face, because this wasn't just a rebuttal, it was something else. Something electric. Crockett then reached for her notes, not to read from them, but to reference actual legislation, actual numbers, actual facts. "You say I'm not offering solutions. So let's be clear. I introduced the Maternal Health Accountability Act. I pushed for independent investigations into police killings. I've worked to expand access to fair housing and legal aid. These aren't hashtags. These are policies. These are lives." She wasn't yelling, but her voice landed like thunder anyway. Every word was precise, like she was cutting through fog. "And as for this idea that I'm promoting division, what's really divisive," she continued, her eyes locking onto Scott's again, "is pretending unity can exist without honesty. What's divisive is telling people who are hurting that they should be quiet for the sake of decorum, that their pain is inconvenient." That's when she paused. Just a few seconds, enough to make the room feel like time had frozen. And then she said it, the line that would echo across the internet. "You say I talk about race too much. But maybe if people like you talked about it more honestly, I wouldn't have to say it so loud." Boom. Silence. Not just in the hearing chamber, but in living rooms across the country, in Twitter feeds and Reddit threads, in every corner of the internet where people were watching live or catching the replay. She hadn't just pushed back, she had turned the entire narrative on its head. Scott's face was tight, frozen in an unreadable expression. For once, he had no comeback ready, no quick pivot, no control over the tone, because Crockett had seized it, and she wasn't done. "You see, Senator," she added, leaning back ever so slightly, "I've been in courtrooms where I watched black boys punished more harshly than white boys for the same crime. I've sat with mothers who buried their sons while prosecutors shrugged. I've seen policies that smile in public and strangle in private. So no, I'm not here to sound pleasant. I'm here to tell the truth. And the truth makes people uncomfortable. That's how you know it's working." Even her allies in the room looked stunned, not because they didn't agree with her, but because of how skillfully, how gracefully, she walked the tightrope between fury and professionalism, passion and poise. She wasn't just fighting back, she was making it impossible not to listen. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a moment. And in politics, moments are everything. The silence after Jasmine's words wasn't awkward. It was powerful. It was the kind of silence that demands reflection, that forces everyone in the room to consider what just happened. For a split second, even the cameras seemed to pause, like they were stunned by the rawness of what had just unfolded. But the silence didn't last, because power hates discomfort, and Senator Scott, still smarting from the sting of Crockett's words, wasn't ready to let her have the last moment. He cleared his throat, shifted in his seat, and leaned back into his microphone, his voice returning with a forced calm that couldn't quite hide the irritation beneath. "Congresswoman, I understand your passion," he said, his tone clipped. "But the danger of relying on emotion is that it blinds us from progress. I come from poverty. I've seen racism, but I refuse to believe that America is defined by it." It was his usual line, a familiar talking point delivered with conviction, polished through countless interviews. "We are not victims," he continued. "We are overcomers. And constantly portraying our communities as helpless doesn't empower them. It paralyzes them." That's when the room began to shift again, not just in words but in energy, because people could feel the subtle tug-of-war unfolding between two very different visions of what it means to be black in America, one rooted in idealism, the other in confrontation. And right in the middle of that battlefield sat Jasmine Crockett, arms crossed, expression calm, but with eyes that were already dismantling his argument before he even finished it. She waited patiently, let him land every word, and then, like she'd been rehearsing it her whole life, she leaned in and said, "You keep talking about progress like it erases pain." That single line reset the entire tone of the hearing. "You say you've seen racism, Senator," she said, "but seeing it isn't the same as naming it. And it definitely isn't the same as fighting it. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Her words cut like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. "You think talking about injustice paralyzes people?" she said. "No, what paralyzes people is pretending it's not there. What paralyzes people is telling a grieving mother her son's death is just a bump in the road toward so-called progress." Across the room, one of the younger aides, barely out of college, blinked hard, clearly shaken by the way Crockett flipped the moral high ground without ever raising her voice. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a reckoning. "You talk about not being victims," Crockett said. "And I agree. We're not. But you know what victims need? Justice, not speeches, not erasure, not denial disguised as hope." A wave of quiet nods rippled across the left side of the room. Even those who had entered the hearing unfamiliar with Crockett were now watching her like she had just taken the mask off of the entire conversation. Because what she was saying wasn't just about politics. It was about truth. Painful, inconvenient, and absolutely necessary truth. "You can wrap it in whatever language you want," she said to Scott. "But if your idea of unity requires silence, then it's not unity, it's submission." That's when the murmurs started. The low buzz of people trying to process something that went deeper than just political disagreement. Because Crockett wasn't just calling out a fellow lawmaker. She was holding up a mirror to an entire system that rewards denial more than honesty. Scott, clearly rattled but trying to maintain his composure, reached for water and gave a slight nod. It was the first time in the hearing that he looked small, not because he had lost a debate, but because he had underestimated the force standing across from him. And Jasmine, she didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just sat back, composed, with the calm confidence of someone who knew she had shifted the conversation forever. This wasn't about clapping back. It was about clarity. And in that moment, the entire nation was watching her, not as a soundbite, but as a storm they didn't see coming. The hearing had moved on, technically. Other voices had jumped in, other topics. Raised, procedural language floated in the air like white noise. But none of it mattered. Not really. Because everyone in that room, and everyone watching online, was still locked into the echo of Jasmine Crockett's words. It was like the energy in the chamber had shifted on a molecular level. The cameras might have swiveled away from her, but the audience didn't. Her name was trending. Hashtags ignited. Clips were already circulating, re-edited, captioned, dissected on TikTok, Twitter, and every platform that moves faster than Washington ever could. But while the internet raged and praised, Jasmine sat still. She knew what she had done, and she knew exactly what was coming, because that kind of truth doesn't go unpunished. Not in politics, and especially not when spoken by a black woman who refuses to play by the script. The attacks came quickly. Commentators called her too aggressive. Pundits tried to twist her passion into partisanship. Certain headlines painted her as angry, divisive, emotional. It was the oldest play in the book. Weaponize the tone to distract from the message. But here's the part they didn't expect. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead of shrinking, she leaned into the storm. She went on MSNBC that night, face calm, voice unwavering. "If people are more offended by my tone than the injustice I'm talking about," she said to the camera, "then they were never listening to begin with." Her words hit like a nerve. She wasn't trying to please anyone. She was trying to wake them up. "My job isn't to sound comfortable," she continued. "My job is to represent people who haven't been heard, who don't have the privilege of speaking softly while they're buried under systems that crush them daily." And just like that, she flipped the narrative again. The same tone they tried to use against her became her weapon. The same emotion they tried to label as unprofessional became the reason millions were now listening. In one viral post, a teacher from Oakland wrote, "My students watched Jasmine Crockett today. They saw someone who looked like them, spoke like them, stand tall in a room designed to silence them. That matters." Another said, "She didn't just speak truth to power. She reminded power that it's not untouchable." Meanwhile, Tim Scott remained quiet. Not a single tweet. No follow-up statement. Just silence. And in politics, silence can say everything. Because Scott wasn't just bested, he was exposed. His carefully crafted image of unity through denial had just been pierced by something far more powerful. Lived experience, backed by real policy and delivered without fear. The next day, as the media swarm buzzed louder, Jasmine showed up to work like it was any other day. No entourage, no press stunt, just her, walking through the Capitol steps with the weight of a cultural moment on her. shoulders and not blinking once under its pressure. A journalist called out, "Congresswoman, any regrets about what you said yesterday?" She didn't stop walking, just turned her head slightly and said, "None. Truth doesn't come with regret." And that was it. That was the quote that made headlines again, because Crockett wasn't chasing the spotlight, it was chasing her. And every step she took proved she knew how to handle it. Her supporters began organizing. Petitions, fundraisers, grassroots movements sparked in real time. Parents were sharing her speech with their kids. Veterans said her voice reminded them what they fought for. And young women, especially black girls, saw her not as a politician but as proof. Proof that they didn't need to tone it down. Proof that speaking up didn't require permission. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just winning arguments. She was building something bigger, a shift in how power is challenged, how truth is delivered, and how courage sounds when it refuses to soften its edges. This wasn't about one moment anymore. It was about the ripple, and the ripple was turning into a wave. As the dust settled and the cameras turned off, what remained wasn't just a viral moment, it was a cultural earthquake. Jasmine Crockett had done more than challenge a senator. She'd cracked open a conversation that many in power had long tried to bury beneath polished speeches and bipartisan talking points. But now it was out in the open, raw and undeniable. And while many expected her to fade quietly back into routine congressional duties, what happened next made one thing clear. Jasmine Crockett wasn't going anywhere. A week later, she returned to the same committee hearing, sat in the same chair and looked around at the same faces. But the room felt different. There was a weight in the air, not of tension but of recognition. Even those who didn't agree with her couldn't deny her presence anymore. The same lawmakers who once rolled their eyes at her fire now chose their words more carefully, their questions more. Dangerous thing you can do in a broken room is tell the truth. If you felt this story, if it moved you, challenged you, or lit a fire inside you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Union Show right now, because we don't just tell stories. We reveal what others hide. Until next time, stay bold, stay loud, and never silence your truth.